after the very rich presentation in which there were matters relating to epistemology, understanding, and normative requirements of this theme, I'm here to present something which has a very, very conservative look. It has almost zero normative content, and that's a big disappointment because I think the expectation is more about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, and I have nothing to say in that regard. All that I'm going to say, and it's a fairly short presentation, is something about a debate that recently occurred between literature and philosophy on the nature of the relation between the human and the non-human animal. And to be more precise, this is about a debate between J.M. Coetzee, the Nobel Prize winner literary figure from South Africa, and Thomas Nagel, a philosopher in New York University. I mean, not a direct confrontation, but whatever debate took place relates to these two figures and their ideas. There's a novel written by Coetzee called Elizabeth Costello. And Elizabeth Costello is, let's say, supposed to be the spokesman, literary, philosophical spokesman for Coetzee. And Thomas Nagel had written a paper in 1974, What is it like to be a bat? This is a paper that when we as students of philosophy, and when I was a student of philosophy, it was central to philosophy of mind and metaphysics. And this is one of the most classic papers that anyone in philosophy would know about. And it's a groundbreaking one. It has a foundational role in steering the debate on the nature of consciousness or the classic mind-body relation problem. And Elizabeth Costello is presented there as denigrating Thomas Nagel, Thomas Nagel's position in this paper, What is it like to be a bat? So what that problem really is will now, I hope, come to the limelight. I say extended consciousness and strained understanding. Some of the things that I had mentioned in the abstract, especially towards the end, they are not being covered here, and I seek an anticipatory bail so that people would excuse me later on for not covering those things. So that would have made the paper much longer and much more struggling one. So to minimize all that, I'm talking about not so much about strained understanding. Yes, there is a bit of strained understanding discussion here, but mostly about consciousness and its possible extension. So I start, there's a kind of grammatical appearance to this kind of paper, to this kind of work, and I hope people would be patient enough to tolerate. So I start with very, very fundamental things like conscious awareness is personal, and I underline personal. And the personal is, precisely speaking, irreducibly first personal. I mean, the connection between personal and first personal is a logical connection, but it may not be obvious. Not just first personal, it is singularly first personal. Okay? The first person singularity of consciousness is also very, very important in the sense that the occurrence of any conscious awareness has its source and limit in a subject, which we call I, the I, which is the ontological correlate of the grammatical subject I, the first person singular pronoun I. So the oblique, the italicized I, is the ontological correlate of the grammatical I, the first person singular pronoun. The self or I is by definition a personal self, and consciousness's origination in and limitation to the personal self inevitably constitutes consciousness as a personally encapsulated phenomenon. Personal self or personal consciousness is a presupposition of, and hence axiomatic in psychology. And I quote William James, who says, the only state of consciousness that we naturally deal with are found in personal consciousness, minds, selves, concrete particular I's and U's. This is from his famous Principles of Psychology. Personal encapsulation of consciousness would seem to make one's cognitive access to another center of personal consciousness impossible. Now, that's the first introduction to an enigma, the enigma of the other mind. That if consciousness is personal, that how do I really know that another center of consciousness is indeed a locus of mental states? So it would seemingly make another center, having access, cognitive access to another center of personal consciousness impossible, thereby creating the notorious philosophical problem of other minds. William James enunciates this point, quote, no thought ever comes into direct sight of a thought in another personal consciousness than its own. Absolute insulation, irreducible pluralism is the law. My consciousness is absolutely insulated against another consciousness. So it's a law of absolute insulation that William James is talking about. Since I have no direct access to your inner life, of which you have unmediated conscious awareness, my claiming to know that you have a subjective mind inside your objective physical makeup would seem to be an enigma, no less than clairvoyance. And yet, contrary to theoretical skepticism, we live in a human world in which you and I near perfectly communicate at the level of subjectivity. Instead of doubt, I'm near absolutely certain that you experience pain and pleasure just as I do. Likewise, you have the same attitude towards me. Pre-theoretical common sense, otherwise known as folk psychology, is non-solipsistic. That means solipsism means only I and my mental states exist. Despite this, his contention that absolute insulation is the law, William James is also not a solipsist. Personally encapsulated centers of consciousness do meet in some common object, which is a testimony to the fact that there are other minds. This is a common object in which all minds meet, which is a testimony to the fact that there are other minds. But this meeting of minds is, for James, of pragmatically motivated supposition. In Essays in Radical Empiricism, James writes, to me, the decisive reason in favor of our minds meeting in some common object, at least, is that unless I make that supposition, I have no motive for assuming that your mind exists at all. It's a pragmatic presupposition. We need it. It works. That's the pragmatism. Why do I postulate your mind? Because I see your body acting in a certain way. It's gestures, facial movements, words, and conduct generally are expressive. So I deem it actuated by my own, as my own ease, by an inner life like mine. So that's James. Your bodily gesture of various kinds in speech and action are expressive of the inner life in you. Again, quote from James, in that perceptual part of my universe, which I call your body, your mind and my mind meet and may be called conterminous, unquote. That is the reason why I postulate your mind. And the so-called common object in which your and my mind meet is the common world that we partake of. Thus, personally encapsulated consciousness manages to establish rapport with a distinct center of consciousness through the expressive quality of the body that inhabits consciousness in a common or shared world. The law of absolute insularity of William James, of distinct centers of consciousness, is not violated by this rapport. Your mind and my mind are still ontologically walled off from one another. Nevertheless, we participate in a collective form of life in which, I put quotation around form of life. This is in allegiance to Ludwig Wittgenstein's definition of form of life, in which I act as though we think and feel into each other's with no significant sense of impediment. This is because we are existentially deeply entrenched in the human form of life. And our common humanity of conspecific coexistence makes our interpersonal understanding a very spontaneous feature of daily life. This is perhaps the reason why neither ontological solipsism nor epistemological skepticism about other minds is a genuine problem. The existence of other minds is thus not quite an enigma, because we know what it is like to be a human being, to the extent that we share the human point of view, the point of view of human subjectivity. Italicized phrases are italicized because they are taken from Thomas Nagel's article that I just mentioned. How far is consciousness subservient? This is a question. This probably is the beginning of, if there is something enigmatic about this whole business. How far is consciousness subservient to the species-specific subjective point of view? That is to say, the subjective point of view that belongs to a particular species, human or non-human. How far is consciousness subservient to the species-specific subjective point of view in being able to form a sense of identification with another center of consciousness? If identification with X means grasping what it is like to be X, then, as Thomas Nagel argues, the particular species-specific point of view must be intrinsic to the consciousness in question. So if there is a human subjective point of view, that's intrinsic to being human. That if it is intrinsic by definition, it can't be shared by members belonging to another species. This would mean that there is no possibility of any species-neutral access to what it is likeness of the inner subjectivity of a particular creature belonging to another species. So, species-neutral subjectivity or subjectivity is species-specific. That's the debate. Being human, I can't identify with the subjectivity of a bat because I can't grasp what it is like to be a bat. Bat subjectivity is an enigma when it is seriously considered from the vantage point of human subjectivity. I mean, if this argument goes through, then that's the problem. That bat subjectivity is opaque to me, so opaque that I can't imagine what it is like to be a bat. Interestingly, what appears to be so enigmatically inaccessible to the discursive reason of philosophy is spontaneously accessible to the literary imagination. Nagel is superseded with deceptive ease by Elizabeth Costello, the literary spokesman of James. When Costello says, despite the disclaimer by Thomas Nagel, there is no limit to the extent to which we can think ourselves into the being of another. There are no bounds to sympathetic imagination. This is Elizabeth Costello.
Costello's also
This literary fictional remark is disguised as a philosophical argument. Indeed, the argument shows up just a little later than the above remark. Now, this is the argument here. If I can think my way into the existence of a being who has never existed, then I can think my way into the existence of a bat or a chimpanzee or even an oyster, and any being with whom I share the substrate of life. Now, if you scrutinize this argument, I'm sure it would appear as a pretty shaky argument. It's a bad argument. It's a slippery slope argument. This argument is pretty shaky, as I was trying to say. Thinking my way into the existence of a non-existent human Mr. Pickwick or Raskolnikov does not require stretching my human consciousness as much as thinking my way into the alien, non-human being of an existing crocodile or an oyster does. That's to say, just because the object of my imagination is fictional and something else is non-fictional, it is more difficult. If I can imagine the fictional or imaginatively identify with the fictional, it should be easier for me to imaginatively identify with the non-fictional, even though the fictional happens to be human and the non-human and the non-fictional existing one, the existing one happens to be non-human. That simply doesn't follow. The question of difficulty is not measured, difficulty of imaginative identification. The question of difficulty is not measured by whether the creature I think myself into is fictional or actual. Rather, it is measured by how distant is the mode of being of the creature from the human, from human consciousness. However, Costello's remark that I think myself into any being with whom I share the substrate of life. This is another remark that she makes in continuing her argument. So this further remark that I can think myself into any being with whom I share the substrate of life. Now, this one makes the argument stronger. But do I really share the substrate of life with the life of a bat, let alone the life of an oyster? Is this sharing meant to be understood in the biological terms of sharing the bulk of DNA molecules and sequencing of genes? Presumably not, because the emphasis on life here must be more existential than biological, even though biology underpins the existential subjectivity of life. What exactly would then be the substrate of life, taken in the sense of what I call existential subjectivity? It must be, I suppose, fundamentally experiences of pain and pleasure, desire and fear, and the impulse to survive in the world. Since I, as a human subject consciousness, roughly share this fundamental substrate with other creatures, their domain of existential subjectivity is not impervious to my sympathetic imagination. After all, just like them, I'm also an animal and sensitive to these basic experiences. A non-human animal and I are fundamentally alike in that we both are two species of the same genus. From now on, I'm playing on this distinction between species and genus. Two species of the same genus, of sentient organisms endowed with consciousness. Costello's argument for the access of sympathetic imagination across species goes through, this argument, this further argument, goes through precisely because the common substrate of life is located at the level of the genus. The common substrate of life that I share with the non-human animal is, of course, at the level of genus. That existential subjectivity and human existential subjectivity are alike at this level of sentience and basic instinct. But then, this wouldn't be a counter-argument to Nagel's denial of the possibility of a human subject successfully imagining what it is like to be a bat. Nagel says it is not possible to imagine what it is like to be a bat. Nagel's own argument rests on the premise that existential subjectivity has a unique particularity, a single point of view, in his word, which is ineluctably species-specific. As I said a little while ago, that if there is human subjectivity of the human type, then that is represented by a kind of point of view, call it subjective point of view, and that's intrinsic to the very species whose subjectivity is in question. That's what species specificity or ineluctable species specificity of the subjective point of view means. Although the bat and I are both experientially alive in the same kind of way, with pain and pleasure and desire for survival, our perceptual modes of being in the world differ quite significantly from one another. Perceptual modes of being in the world. Bat perceptual subjectivity is entirely grounded in echolocation, which is involved in information processing needed to enable its survival in the environment. This is inevitably quite unlike our multimodal perceptual modes of experiencing the world. Sensory modalities centrally constitute the character of conscious subjectivity and thereby set the phenomenological boundary of species-specific subjectivity. Species-specific subjectivity has a phenomenological boundary because the phenomenological configuration of that subjectivity would differ one from another across species. In an important sense, sensory constitution is part of the substrate of life. What it is like to live a particular form of life is crucially determined by what I call constitutive configuration of the substrate of life. The configuration of human sensory constitution differs non-trivially from that of the bat. Therefore, the bat form of life differs subjectively as well as objectively from that of the human animal. Is this difference a difference in degree rather than in kind? Costello thinks it is a difference in degree and proclaims the possibility of human sympathetic imagination taking quantum leaps to the degree of crossing the phenomenological boundary of species-specific subjectivity. Philosophical circumspection, I think, would find this claim to be untenable because it entails stretching imaginative consciousness too far by neglecting the constraints of constitutive configuration of subjectivity. The bat's ecolocatory mode of being in the world constitutively lends specificity to the bat existential subjectivity of its life experience. It is this phenomenological specificity of bat subjectivity, underscored by Nagel, which is an enigma to a subject of consciousness. To quote Nagel, it will not help me to try to imagine that one has webbing on one's arms, which enables one to fly around at dusk and dawn, catching insects in one's mouth. This is about the bat. That one has very poor vision and perceives the surrounding world by a system of reflected high-frequency sound signals, ... Insofar as I can imagine this, which is not very far, it tells me only what it would be like for me to behave as a bat behaves. But that is not the question. I want to know what it is like for a bat to be a bat. This is Nagel. A subject of experience is, I'm saying, a subject, and on behalf of Nagel, a subject of experience is not a generalizable subject of consciousness, so that one can be a subject of any possible experience as long as one is actually a subject of consciousness of any particular species. A subject of experience is rather an individuated subject. I'm using some technical philosophical expression. An individuated subject of consciousness. And the principle of individuation is determined by the constitutive configuration of the species to which the subject belongs. This is where the difference between Costello and Nagel lies. By individuation, I mean a particular subject subject of consciousness is individuated as that type of subject which is determined by the specific configuration that that type of subjectivity has. For Costello, although a human subject is humanly individuated, it can be imaginatively displaced. I mean, the subject can be imaginatively displaced from its human locus. It is therefore essentially an unindividuated subject of consciousness. Unindividuated. Capable of becoming a subject of non-human modes of consciousness as well. Although it is actually a subject of human experience, Costello thinks, it is potentially a subject of conscious states that are actually states of non-human creatures. Now, this capacity of consciousness for access across species would make the human subject a species-neutral subject. Is it a species-neutral subject? Subject of experience. Although directly acquainted only with human-specific experiences, this subject, the human subject, can indirectly, that is to say, imaginatively, familiarize itself with unfamiliar non-human experiences. Unfamiliar phenomenological specificity of experiences, human or non-human, is no deterrent to access by imaginative consciousness for Costello. The debate between Costello and Nagel concerns whether phenomenological specificity of experience puts a constraint on knowing imaginatively what it is like to be the subject of a given experience. Well, it does for Nagel, and it doesn't for Costello. Is this basically a difference between philosophical imagination and literary imagination? Or is there a logical stricture that doesn't warrant philosophical imagination to go so wild that it turns itself into literary imagination? Well, this is not a question of disciplinary conservatism or liberalism about imagination, but of the nature of the connection between imagination and consciousness. How far can human imagination extend and extrapolate in reconfiguring the contours of consciousness? How would I know by mere imagination that this is how the bat existential subjectivity is possibly configured? If the data of consciousness provide the resources for imaginative extrapolation of experience, do I possess adequate subjective resources needed to capture the bat experiential subjectivity in its right phenomenological configuration? The philosophical hurdle that cannot be jumped over is the subject self, me, that ineluctably appropriates the awareness of being a bat or being whatever. Whenever I imagine being some non-human creature, I would end up imagining, as Nagel says, what it would be like for me to behave as a bat instead of what it would be like for a bat to be a bat. That's what I mean by the subject self ineluctably appropriates the awareness of another possible imagined experience. There is a conceptual connection between the conscious subject that I am and the humanly configured subjectivity that I inhabit. It's a logical connection. I cannot be a surrogate subject of a non-humanly configured subjectivity, because the alternative configuration has a distinct phenomenology of which I, a human subject, cannot truly be a subjective locus. For each specifically configured type of subjective experience, there is a unique kind of subject of consciousness inherent in that type of phenomenological configuration. Now, just for an analogy, as an explanatory, heuristic explanatory aid, within parentheses I write, this is like saying, for each geometrical circle, there is a center point that is inherent in the configuration of the space bounded by the circle. I hope that clarifies the logic of the argument. Nagel's point would be that a conscious subject or self is not an abstract center of consciousness. Abstract should be underlined, really. Not an abstract center of consciousness which is capable of accessing any concrete experiential content, whether that experiential content is that of a specific fellow subject or a creature of another species. Rather, the subject is substantively formed by the experiences it actually has in virtue of the constitutive features of its embodiment. If experiential possibilities are delimited by constitutive features of embodiment, the embodied subject cannot enjoy unlimited possibility of imaginative accession to varieties of experiential content. As a subject of human embodiment, I am therefore destined to fail to identify myself fully with the subject of that embodiment, the subject which has exclusive accession to that existential point of view or that phenomenological subjectivity. This is because an embodied subject is individuated by the constitutive conditions of embodiment. Accordingly, experiential possibilities are differentially distributed, as it were, amongst subjects of differing embodiment. And the subjective point of view from which the subject belonging to a particular species is aware of its life, that subjective point of view is evidently not a shared point of view across species of different embodiment. I'm repeating an earlier argument. Costello fails to decipher Nagel's subtle argument about the intrinsic species specificity of the subjective point of view. The subjective point of view, which is internally connected to a conscious being's awareness of what it is like for it to be that being. Failing to see this, she accuses for wrongly suggesting that to be able to experience that subjectivity, we need to have that sensory equipment or constitution. For Costello, the subjective point of view is a shared point of view amongst all subjects of sentient existence in the animal kingdom. Yeah, I'm finished, yes. This is true, and I think that Nagel would not deny this either. But this is a characterization of subjectivity defined in terms of sentience at the genus level. Sentience is a shared feature of subjectivity amongst all animals, which is what makes each animal each animal a subject of experience of pain and pleasure. However, shared subjectivity at the genus level is consistent with unshared subjectivity at the level of species, especially when it comes to what philosophers call creature consciousness, the consciousness of being a particular creature as such, or consciousness of what it is like for the subject to be that particular creature it is. At the level of state consciousness, which is distinguished from state creature consciousness, that is to say, awareness of a particular sensory state of sound or taste, etc., there may not be much difference in the subjective character of experience occurring in two creatures of different species. But there is also an undifferentiated, this is the crux of the argument, undifferentiated and unitary subjective feel of one's being the subject of a particular species, human or non-human, that is phenomenologically unique, or unique in its singular subjective feel to the creature in question. Nagel's philosophical project in What Is It Like to Be a Bat is intended to reveal the challenge that the subjectivity of consciousness poses to its grasp from the objective standpoint. The intractability of consciousness, he argues for, concerns the subjectivity or species-specific creature consciousness, not the subjectivity of state consciousness. The inner epistemic accession to the what it is likeness of creature consciousness, its singular subjective felt content, is an absolute monopoly of the creature in question. Costello's literary imagination, this is the last imagination, literary observation is not deep enough to discern the subtle distinction, as it were, of coarse-grained subjectivity at the genus level and the fine-grained subjectivity at the level of species. I can imagine what it is like for a bat or a parrot to be hit hard by the throw of a stone. I can imagine its feeling pain the way I would if my body were to be similarly hit hard. This is coarse-grained, experiential similarity that can non-problematically be ascribed at the genus level to individual organisms across species. However, I cannot imagine what it is like to be a bat or a parrot if what it is likeness in question is that of being the kind of creature that a bat or a parrot is. For this subjectivity of creature consciousness, the subjective feel of being the whole creature cannot be captured by some kind of imaginative calculation of the relations amongst various part experiences that the creature episodically undergoes in the course of its life. It is one undifferentiated experiential whole that cannot be perspicuously recognized to be the product of interaction amongst phenomenologically differentiated experiential episodes. When Nagel characterizes that subjectivity as alien to human subjectivity, he implies the impermeable content of creature consciousness in its unique singularity. That certainly is an enigma, because the singularity of creature consciousness rules out the availability of a general viewpoint from which one could imagine what it is like to be that creature. It would be grossly mistaken to think that Nagel's philosophical conclusion entails that we cannot genuinely and seriously relate to non-human animals. Certainly we can. But that possibility is predicated on our ability imaginatively to identify with such creatures at the genus level. Bats and parrots are not alien to humans at the genus level. Indeed, the bat and I are fellow animals. Our fellowship is cemented by the coarse-grained subjectivity that we share as organisms located in the unified zoological continuum. Nagel's philosophical deliberation on bat subjectivity implies no contention that disables human compassion for non-human animals. The possibility of such compassion does not depend on being able to imagine what it is like to be a non-human creature from the standpoint of creature consciousness. It only depends depends on the ability to imagine life. For bats and parrots and others, you feel pain or pleasure here or then. That's it.